Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, and I'm going to ask you to keep it brief for a change. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
I don't know if I can be brief.
You can never be brief. That's why I'm asking you to be brief.
We'll see what happens here. One of our listeners wrote me asking about, and I apologize because I make it a point to record people's names when they write in with questions. And this one I didn't because I didn't realize I was going to use it. But now that I'm thinking about it, I think I will. So listener, whoever you are, thank you for writing. But here's the question. The listener asked, can you speak to the impact of immigrants on taxation in this country? This person was having a conversation with someone who was insisting that the problem with immigration, particularly illegal immigration, is that the people that are coming in, they're using our welfare system, social systems, they aren't paying in taxes.
You and I wrote an article about this many years ago.
We did. It was around about 2018 in U.S. News.
It was 2018 U.S. News and World Report. That's right. I still send that link out from time to time.
Yeah, as do I. And I went back and looked at that link, and there was some stuff there that I had forgotten that is good to remember. So let me lay out basically what's going on here when you talk about immigrants. And when we think about immigrants here, let's talk about undocumented, so illegal immigrants. What do they pay in taxes? Well, it turns out that they don't pay federal income tax because if you're illegal, you're not, of course, filing taxes. So you're not paying federal income tax. And people will point to that and say, yeah, well, see, there's the problem. They're not paying into the system. But I will remind people that in the United States, on average, the bottom 60% of people by income receive more back from the federal government in tax credits than they pay in the first place. And the illegal immigrants would, I'm sure, almost all of them fall into that category of the lower 60%. So to say that they're not paying federal income tax is actually a good thing, because what it means is, yes, they're not paying in, but if they were paying in, they'd be drawing back in credits even more than they're paying in. So the federal government's at a net plus here. Now, about half of them do pay into Social Security, which is interesting.
Wait a second. Now, how can that possibly be?
Yeah, because how can this be if they're not documented? Well, it turns out the Social Security Administration has set up an alternative to the Social Security number. It's called the ITIN, which stands for something I can't remember, in something, I don't know, tax identification, or certainly two of the letters. But the ITIN stands in for a Social Security number when you don't have a Social Security number. And you can get one of these things, apparently, if you're illegal. Maybe I would presume that the employer gets on your behalf, but the net result is that you're paying into Social Security. So your Social Security taxes are being withheld. On top of that, illegal immigrants are never going to receive Social Security benefits. So this is a net plus across the board to Social Security, to the tune of, when we wrote the article back in 2018, about $13 billion a year. $13 billion a year the Social Security Administration is receiving because of illegal immigrants, and it will never have to pay out the benefits to them. What else do we have? We have sales tax and property tax, and clearly they pay those because you pay that at the point of sale, or you pay it because you have your license to own a car or whatever it is. The only thing that I can find that they aren't paying that is a net minus is state income tax. And of course, that's going to vary anywhere from Florida, which is 0, to I don't know what you have in Arizona.
About 5.
Pennsylvania, we were 3%, you're 5%. Okay, so depending on the state you're talking about, anywhere from 0 to I think the top is maybe 8 or 10%. But that's it. I would imagine that that one tax that we're not collecting is more than outweighed by those other taxes that we are collecting.
It's a net plus to the tax coffers of the United States of America to allow illegal immigrants in.
Yeah, I think it is. Now, someone's going to say, yeah, but what about, they send their kids to public school or they use the healthcare system? I don't know what to say to that. I don't know what the numbers we're looking at are there. But I would imagine that when all the dust settles, I would be surprised if the costs on that side are exceeding the benefits that we're receiving from the taxes that they are paying.
My guess is that it ends up being a bit of a wash.
Maybe, although I keep coming back to that Social Security, and that's the biggest tax that lower income people pay is Social Security.
Yep.
That's what, 12% of your wages, you plus the employer, and that's pure profit for Social Security.
By the time you're all said and done on both sides of that equation, it's about 13%.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, you kept it, no, you didn't keep it short at all. So, of course, and as usual, I'll be forced to keep my things brief, which are, infinitely more interesting than yours. I also respond to a listener's email, and I also can't remember the man's name who wrote it. I set it aside so I would remember, but then last week you took so much time I couldn't speak at all. But anyway, he seemed to recall that I enjoy getting things about medical technology, and indeed I do. And you and I have talked about a cure for cancer, right, in the past, and how it's likely a non-starter because there are so many different kinds of cancer that you're really not talking about the same disease. You're talking about a panoply of diseases, right? And you're going to have to cure them all individually, one after the next. Well, maybe not. Listen to this headline. New molecular jackhammer technique achieves 99% cancer treatment success in labs.
Wow.
And it's one of those inventions that comes around by accident, the way almost all truly great inventions do, right? And I'm thinking of things as disparate as penicillin on the one hand,
penicillin,
and LSD on the other.
Right.
Somebody just notices something in a lab and their course of study is irretrievably altered from that moment forward. Well, there's a guy named Dr. Tour at Rice University down in Texas, and we get this short paragraph in the middle, and I want you to really think about what this might mean. Using Tour's lab, Rice University scientists and collaborators discovered atoms of a small dye molecule that's currently used for medical imaging can vibrate in unison when stimulated by near-infrared light. This causes the cell membrane of cancerous cells to rupture. And what doesn't rupture? Every non-cancerous cell.
Wow, that's amazing.
They happened into a way to target cancerous cells using a dye that's available off the rack and infrared light, which has been available for decades. Two things they already had might well come together to cure all forms of cancer. Isn't that astonishing?
Your intro to this reminded me of a great quote, and I want to say it was Isaac Asimov, but it was one of the great science fiction writers who said that most discoveries are not preceded by the exclamation "Eureka," but rather, that's odd.
I think, yeah, that's right. And we can carry that observation forward for a moment when we go to the foolishness of the week, because I read a story and I thought, that's odd.
That's odd.
And it was from our good friends in the great state of Florida for the foolishness of the week. You might have heard that the DeSantis administration and all the other little politicians down there had gathered together to figure out how to ban all the dirty books, to keep all the naughty thoughts from the public school students. Do you remember this?
Right.
Well, come to find out, the way the law is written, guess what books have been banned?
What?
Dictionaries.
You're kidding. Oh my God, I love it.
Because come to find out, dictionaries, and we can throw encyclopedia in here too, have naughty words in them. So they have to be banned.
This goes back to you a couple of episodes ago saying, look, you either have free speech or you don't. There's not a middle ground.
When your answer is don't, all kinds of foolishness comes along.
That's right.
And here we go. And look, before everybody starts, and I know they're all going to start, before you all start, I am well aware that the librarians are making a point here. I'm well aware that they said, well, we read the law and I guess we have to get rid of the dictionary. I know that they're being, what would be that technical term, a pain in the to the local politicians, that this was not the intent of the law. But this is the letter of the law, and the letter of the law must be followed.
Yeah, and see, this is the thing. You can call them to task for being a pain about this, but if they hadn't done this, later on someone was going to come along and use that law to ban something that we don't want banned. But they're going to say, hey, this is the letter of the law. Let's take care of this now rather than then.
Yep. And look, you have to realize that when you start deciding things like this, you are never going to be able to cut that line closely enough.
Yep.
There will always be things that drift from one side to the other. And I remember a few years ago when I lived in the great and retrograde state of Utah, there was a local, what would be that word, kerfuffle about pornography in the school libraries. And it came to be that the pornography were recreations in book and card form of the great artwork of Western civilization.
Yeah, right.
Anywhere you might find a wayward booby in an artwork, everybody would lose their minds and they'd say, oh, the children are looking at pornography.
Yeah.
This was the same local culture that had us all debating whether the posters outside of the Victoria's Secret in town were pornographic in nature. In other news, there was a Victoria's Secret in town, which seems odd enough when you think it through. But look, this is the kind of bullshit that you're going to have to put up with when you decide to legislate this kind of thing. And the question should always be, is this the kind of bullshit we want to put up with? And the answer should always be no. If Junior can't handle looking at dirty words in a dictionary, maybe Junior shouldn't be going to school at all.
Well, yeah, or look at it another way. Maybe we're upset about that, but that's going to have to be the price that you pay for free speech. And you got to ask yourself, is free speech worth that price? I'd be hard-pressed to say no.
I don't think it's a free speech issue to the extent that you apparently do, because I would never say that in a fourth grade library at school that we should have Playboy magazines or free speech has been somehow undermined, right? There are rational limits here. And I think rational people understand what rational limits are. And the rational limit is not the dictionary.
Well, but here's the thing. We leave it to the librarians themselves to figure out what books are and are not in the library. Why not just leave this question to the librarians?
I'm totally fine with that. Totally fine with it. And if certain individual librarians in certain towns go too far and have books in the library that they shouldn't have, that's a discussion for people to have at the local level.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. This week's topic comes courtesy of listener Peter Tierney, who said, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but Robert Reich has posted his class Wealth and Poverty that he teaches at Berkeley on YouTube. I was watching his class and had a question for you in class 2, and Peter thankfully gives us the timestamp because this video is an hour and a half long. Robert Reich talks about the role of corporations and whether they should be engaged in stakeholder capitalism or shareholder capitalism. I was wondering if you could comment on this discussion and what is the appropriate role of corporations.
Well, this is an interesting thing. First, I can say right off the top of my head that we can go back to 1970, where Milton Friedman discusses exactly this thing in a very famous New York Times article that he wrote. We'll leave the notes for that in the show notes for you. You can click through and go read it. And I would advise you to go read it. It's fantastic. But oddly enough, I came to this question for the first time in my academic life until I watched a movie by Michael Moore called Roger and Me, which was his first really big movie, right? It was a big budget alleged documentary in which he chased around the CEO of GM and tried to get him to account for what happened in Flint, Michigan, the town, when GM pulled out. It took all of its resources out of the area, right? So they used to make a lot of their cars there, and then they no longer did. And of course, Flint, Michigan went right into the toilet. It destroyed the town. And let's just be honest. What happens when a major employer leaves and nothing fills that vacuum, and nothing did in Flint, Michigan, is abject poverty.
Right.
And the interesting question, and I think it was an interesting question that Michael Moore asked, that our listener asks, and that Milton Friedman asks, and that today we're going to ask, is what do corporations owe the communities in which they operate? Now, Michael Moore seemed to think the answer to that was a lot. Milton Friedman, not to jump to the end, but the too long didn't read version of this is not a whole a lot. And then there's wherever you and I come down on this.
This goes to something that has been taught in MBA programs for a while now. And by a while, I mean at least a decade, maybe 2 decades. They refer to what they call the triple bottom line, which is a fancy way of saying that the corporation has a responsibility to stakeholders, and this term stakeholder means not just shareholders, but also the community, the workers, and on and on and on, which is...
Well, all right, hold the phone. Explain what a triple bottom line is, because you just named 2 groups and moved on.
Oh, no, triple bottom line. If I get this right, there's the single bottom line, which is your revenue, the double bottom line, which is your profit. Right, yeah.
Got it. Okay. All right. So for those of you mystified at home, you draw one line under a certain category, but your end of the year profits would have 2 lines.
That's right.
Underneath.
The double underline.
And that's the category that everybody cares about. How much did the company make?
Right.
Now Anthony's telling us that in MBA programs across the country, there is a triple bottom line.
Right.
Which, if I'm hearing you correctly, will always be lower than the double bottom.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's going to be lower than the other because, and this is where this term stakeholder comes in, which was manufactured, again, I don't know, by MBA programs, but it wouldn't surprise me. Shareholder, these are the people who have put their money on the line for the corporation. So the corporation would not exist without them. They provide this cash. The stockholders.
To be clear, corporations, under the standard theory of all things business, corporations exist to further the interests of the shareholders.
Right. That's exactly right.
They're the owners of the business. You can have a single person owning a pizza parlor on the corner, but you can have hundreds of thousands of people owning Domino's or Pizza Hut nationwide.
Yeah.
But it's the same.
You're exactly right.
You're a part owner in that gigantic pizzeria.
Yeah. And, to bring it down to the personal level, picture yourself, you mortgage your house to start a business, and the business is just you doing whatever it is that you do. And you would look oddly at anyone who came along and asked you, well, who does your business exist to benefit? Well, of course it exists to benefit me. That's why I started it. And if someone starts telling you, well, no, you need to consider the community and, so on and so forth, all these other things, you'd say, yeah, but the community didn't put their money on the line. The community didn't mortgage their house to fund my business. I did.
Let's also be clear about something else before we really get rolling here. All businesses, all business owners are concerned with the community because the community is the sum total of his customer base.
Right. Yes. Yeah. They are concerned with it. That's the irony.
So having good relations with the community is a pretty good thing. We all think about the soup Nazi in Seinfeld. No soup for you. Well, if anybody ever said that to me, I'd never go back.
Right.
You have to treat customers well.
You have to treat them well. You have to treat your employees well because they'll walk for the same reason.
That's right. Even indifference generally loses you a lot of business.
Yeah.
You have to go out of your way to treat your customers pretty well. And every businessman knows this, right? So this is the universe in which we operate. We have a bunch of people saying, well, you, Antony Davies, Mr. Business Owner, what are you giving back to the community?
Yeah, and I think this is the thing. Business owners, as you say, they're already concerned with the community. They're concerned with their workers, but they have to balance that concern against, maintaining the business, this sort of thing. But the triple bottom line thing, when you start to talk about stakeholders, it's to go one step further. It's to say that, well, okay, business, after you did all that you did, you earned a profit. Now, that profit must indicate that you've taken something from the community. You've taken something from your workers, and you should, as you say, give back.
That's what the phrase give back indicates, right? That you have, in fact, taken something. Now, in a manner of speaking, you have. You took your customers' money, but you actually exchanged something for it.
Right. They took the product that your company's producing. And this is the thing. When people talk about giving back, they're only looking at one half of the transaction. The money the business takes. They don't look at the product. I used to ask my students, how many of you think that Steve Jobs, this was back when Steve Jobs was alive, Steve Jobs worth $8 billion, that he should give some of that back? And of course, half the students put their hands up. And I said, okay, let's tell him he has to give back half of this money that he's earned. And in exchange, we have to give back half of our iPhones, because that was the other half of the transaction. And all of a sudden, you could see the lights going off in their heads saying, well, I don't want to give back my iPhone. Well, that's the whole point. You received something you liked better than your money.
And he didn't want to give back the $4 billion
Right.
that would have been half of his net worth. I mean, of course he didn't. He wasn't an idiot. And Friedman sees this angle of the argument, right? And he says something really interesting. When you talk about giving back, this is our vernacular, not exactly his, but listen to this paragraph that I've got open from this piece back in 1970. The stockholders or the customers or the employees could separately spend their own money on the particular action if they wished to do so. So they could all go and act charitably in any way they wanted. The executive is exercising a distinct social responsibility rather than serving as an agent of the stockholders or the customers or the employees, only if he spends the money in a different way other than they would have spent it.
Right.
So, okay, you can demand social responsibility, whatever the hell that really means, right? It's one of those indefinable terms that people just toss around because then they can pump whatever answer they want today into the balloon that is that thing, right? It just keeps expanding. But anybody on Earth can do exactly what these people claim everybody should always be doing.
Right. In other words, rather than the company spending, pick a number, $1 million giving back, whatever way that is, instead of doing that, give it as dividends to your stockholders. And then they can give it to the community or do whatever. And if the fact is, if the stockholders don't want to give it to the community, it is their money to begin with, why are we putting pressure on the corporation to do it?
And that's exactly Friedman's point, right? The people who own the business are entitled to the profits.
Yeah.
And they can do anything they want with said profits. If they don't want to give it to charitable things, well, then that's just how it is. And you shouldn't be able to force anybody to do that. And this is an interesting thing that I've seen played out in person. I'm going to preface this by saying I think charity is a private matter. I don't think anybody should ever talk about their charitable giving unless you're trying to encourage people to see a cause that maybe you think is deserving. I don't think you should grandstand about charitable giving. But ask yourself, of all the uber progressives in your midst who think we should be doling out other people's money to all kinds of causes and projects, how many of them sponsor children in foreign countries? Because in my universe, the answer to that question is zero or near zero. Why do they want to force everybody else to do what they have just proven they're not willing to do themselves?
Well, yeah, and I think the mindset here is they know better how other people should be spending their money. Worse than that, they think of other people's money as theirs, or I should say ours collectively.
And not only that, they also seem to assume that there's an infinite supply of it. Friedman makes the point here, people are almost never willing to do privately what a group of people think everyone should be forced to do publicly.
Right.
And Friedman digs in his heels and says, sorry, but no, that's not going to do. You just can't do it. Why is that incorrect, Ant? I mean, is that necessarily incorrect? They can co-opt the political process to get these answers anytime they want.
They can, but the weird thing is, you're assuming that people are going to behave one way in the ballot box in a different way when they're pulling money out of their wallet. And that makes no sense to me, this idea that we need the government to control people's charitable giving because if it didn't, they wouldn't give anything. Okay, but we're not controlling their votes. We're not telling them they have to vote for the politicians who are going to advocate charitable giving. Somehow they're saints in one instance and sinners in the other.
Yeah, so when you look at stakeholder capitalism, right, which is this belief the community deserves something that a corporation has, the corporation should give it freely, but if it doesn't, it should be taken. What we get is this assertion that a group of people that owns nothing in terms of the stock shares of the corporation or a private business, whatever, somehow deserves the proceeds.
the people on the other side of this argument will come back at you and say something like, yes, but look at this corporation that's made all this profit, and it's made it at the expense of the workers, the expense of the customers. And that argument might, and I underline heavily might, apply in theoretical cases where it's an absolute monopoly and we have no other choice but to do business with this firm. But generally speaking, and by generally I mean 99.99% of the cases, what's happened is the person on the other side of the argument has misunderstood the nature of profit. They've misunderstood the nature of exchange, goes back to only looking at the dollars, not seeing the goods and services.
I think backing up that perspective is, why is the opposite not true? If the business loses money in your community, why should the community not gather together and give it more money?
And that's a fascinating question, because if you're going to be even-handed here and say that the business has an obligation to the community, then you've got to go the other direction, just as you've said. Customers out there, this business is faltering, you should be paying 20% more. And we should force you to pay 20% more to bolster this business.
And you know what often happens, Ant, when communities find out that some businesses are in trouble, they do exactly that. But they show up and they patronize the business when maybe they wouldn't have otherwise.
And they do it voluntarily because they believe in it.
That's right. And they say things like, well, our community would be far, far less wonderful than it is if the corner pizzeria went out of business.
Yeah.
So let's throw more business towards the corner pizzeria. And you realize that, okay, sometimes that happens. When doesn't that happen? Well, we had a bunch of stores recently that shut down their operations in San Francisco because they weren't able to stem the tide of theft, and the homeless problem was out of control, and they had people pooping on the sidewalks in front of their businesses, which meant that other people weren't patronizing. They left. Nobody came to their rescue. Mm-hmm. Their customer base didn't do it voluntarily, and the towns didn't jump in to say, well, tell you what, not only will we give you a tax break, but here, take all this taxpayer money and stay open.
Right.
That never happens. So why do we expect it to happen on the other side of the equation? And we're back to Michael Moore's essential question. What does a business owe to the community in which it operates? Milton Friedman says nothing. Michael Moore says quite a lot.
Yeah, but I have to say, in fairness, it does happen. But it does happen when the business people involved co-opt the government. And I'm thinking here of bailouts, the bank bailouts back in the 1980s of General Motors, Chrysler. What's happening with those bailouts is the people within the corporation are able to co-opt the politicians to take the taxpayer money to keep the business going.
I'm going to point out that that's a different argument. That's not a community argument. That's an argument too big to fail in its nature.
Yeah.
Right. That's an argument that the country as a whole needs these businesses to be open and operative.
I don't buy the too big to fail argument.
Nor do I. I think that's nonsense, but that's nonsense for a different episode. The nonsense for this episode is that the city council, or whatever they call it in San Francisco, doesn't give CVS $3 million to stay open. And yet they would have taxed CVS to fund some sort of park refurbishing.
Right.
Because CVS needs to give back. Well, why doesn't the community need to give back?
Let me throw out an instance in which I partially agree with the other side. And that's an instance in which the business is, for example, polluting the waterways or polluting the air in the community. And there you say, okay, well, this business has an obligation to give back to the community to repair this damage that it's done. And there, I say the problem ultimately is a government failure. And people look at this and they call it honestly a market failure. This is the evil profit-seeking business is just polluting the environment. That's not a market failure, it's a government failure. Because the people of the community have property rights. They have rights to this water that runs through here that I drink in and it's not polluted. And if it is polluted, the government isn't doing its job. To say that the company needs to be thinking about stakeholders, no, the government has to be thinking about why isn't it enforcing the clean water laws or the clean air laws.
And you would have to make the case that clean air and water laws are functionally different from any other kind of law that would force corporations to cede some of their profits to the communities in which they operate.
There's a big difference between demanding the corporation cede profits because it has harmed someone and demanding it cede profits simply because we want some of its profits.
So there we are, but we haven't answered the actual question. Do corporations owe anything to the locations where they operate? Friedman says no, absolutely not.
I agree. Provided they're operating within the law, they're not imposing costs on anybody, absolutely. No more obligation to the community than the community has to them.
And that's, I think, the interesting wrinkle that nobody ever gets to. Why is it not a relationship that flows in both directions?
And that's a weird thing because it is a relationship that flows in both directions, but it flows voluntarily.
It mirrors the same difficulty we have in the transaction where all we see is the money and we never see the satisfied customer.
Yep.
We're really good at seeing half of a thing, but it takes a little bit of effort to see the other half.
I think there's a good reason for that, and that is we are very particular about measuring one half of that. The company tracks its revenues and expenses, and we can see this is how much profit it made. It's counted in dollars. Everybody knows what this is. It's very easy to track it. What we can't measure is how much happiness you got. You went, I know you love ice cream, James. You go to the local ice cream thing and you buy yourself the thing of ice cream and you pay, I don't know what you pay, $5 for it. How much happiness did it bring you?
$6 billion.
I've seen this man eat ice cream. He loves it. He would say, oh, it's worth to me $50, but I only paid $5, which means you walked away with, in effect, a $45 profit. Not a profit in dollars, but a profit in happiness. And that is never counted. We can't count it. And as a result, we tend to ignore it. But it's every bit as real as the dollar profit the corporation makes on the other side.
In the end, unsurprisingly, we both agree with Milton Friedman and we don't agree with Michael Moore.
Or in this case, Robert Reich. Peter Tierney, thank you for giving us this topic.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.